Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and I want to talk about chapter 15 this week. So, this chapter is really about kind of reform and revolution, if you will, and it's really interesting because last week we talked about Enlightenment thought and Enlightenment philosophy, and a lot of that was, besides a push towards science and reason, a lot of that was about freedom and liberty and natural rights. So, some of this philosophy at this point has sort of penetrated the air supply, and it really wasn't around before 1700. This notion of liberty and freedom and democracy, and you could view it as a historian, you could view it as a response to absolutism. So we talked about the notion of absolute monarchy in the last chapter, this idea where the king is in charge of everything. Take France, for example, where there's really no parliament to speak of. This idea of absolute rulers, whether it's a theocracy or a monarchy, is certainly something that has been in place as far as government structure goes in these chapters prior to chapter 15. So now we're at chapter 15, and sort of the really big events here, of course, is the War for Independence, which is the same as our Revolutionary War, what we call the Revolutionary War, and then also the French Revolution just a little bit later in the late 1700s. So if you think about those two things for a second, it's important to understand the differences between these two revolutions or reform movements. So in the case of independence from the colonies, what is to be the United States, the colonists uprose or had an uprising against England. So they broke away from the mother country. Eventually, the United States is formed. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. But our Revolutionary War was really about a colony splitting away from its mother country, in this case, England. The French Revolution is significantly different because in the French Revolution, the citizens of France had an uprising against Louis XVI. And again, when we talk about absolute monarchy, certainly Louis XVI was an absolute monarch. Now, there was a parliament in sorts in France called the Estates Generales, but really didn't have any power at all as far as government's concerned. And its only function was for the king to call on them when more taxes were needed, when more revenue was needed. So the French Revolution and the U.S. Revolution are different, but at the same time, the fundamentals out of both of them, this idea of liberty and fairness and democracy, are similar. So those are sort of the biggies in chapter 15, but as with our textbook, it goes through what's going on in all other areas of the world. And so besides the U.S. War for Independence, the French Revolution, I just want to mention the Haitian Revolution, which takes place shortly thereafter in the 1800s. Not a lot of people know about the Haitian Revolution, but it's important because it was the first successful slave rebellion. In other words, the people of color, the slaves in Haiti, rose up against their rulers, which were French, and defeated them. And the cool thing about the Haitian Revolution is that many of the people in Haiti, many of the slaves, were learning about the French Revolution when it took place. So that kind of planted this seed for independence and liberty. And it's interesting to see how these ideas sort of float around the world at the same time and lead to ideas and lead to uprisings in other areas. So the Haitian Revolution is on page 573. You should read about that. As far as South and Central America goes, pages 576 to 578, it's interesting to read about Brazil there and the relationship with Brazil and Portugal, the mother country. So that's an interesting read. And then the other thing that's big in this chapter is, we talked about slavery in the last chapter, and now we're talking about the end of the slave trade. Denmark was the first country in 1803, and then finally U.S. in 1808. Now, that doesn't mean slavery was outlawed. Obviously, in the U.S., it went on until, the mid-1800s, until the end of the Civil War. But the slave trade itself, this idea of taking captives from Africa and selling them here, was ended in 1808. So just keep that in mind. It's something that's important to know, especially as we get into the next chapter and we read about sort of the remnants of slavery and when slavery will end for good. The section on 580 is important. So it's the Industrious Revolution, then the Industrial Revolution, and I'll spend a little bit more talking about that. But basically, the Industrial Revolution starts in England with textile manufacturing, and the cotton that the English are using is coming from the U.S., picked by slaves. And the Industrial Revolution really starts in England in the 1700s, and then we will have our own Industrial Revolution here in the U.S. in the mid-1800s. But the Industrial Revolution in England also carries over into other areas of Europe, including France, not so much Spain, but France and what is to become Germany. So we're looking at Prussia right now. But just keep in mind that the Industrial Revolution really changes everything, because we start to see, in the Western world anyway, in Europe, we start to see the growth of urban areas. So, now the population is starting to change. There's fewer farmers, fewer people are living off of agriculture, and more people are living in cities. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution in England. So read about the Industrial Revolution. It's important. As far as the Middle East is concerned, there's really not too much change there. So the big takeaway from the Middle East reading in chapter 15 is that there's really no major reform movements like there are in Europe and the Americas, and it's really similar to what's going on in China. Those cultures are a little bit more insular, don't have as much trade with the West, and these ideas about reform and revolt either don't exist or are muted or both. So that's the thing to know about China and the Middle East. They didn't quite develop like Western Europe did or like the Americas did when we're looking at the late 1700s. The other thing that's important when we get to India, and as we've been reading about India in these other chapters, we've been reading about the Mughal Empire, and it's important to know that in around 1767, somewhere in there, the British start to take over India and eventually colonize the entire country. So that's something that's going to last up until World War II for sure. And a lot of the Indian customs today and Indian law is all based on the English system and English legal system. So that's why it is the way it is. As far as China is concerned in this time period, again, the Qing dynasty is still in place. Not too much change there. The book talks about the Opium Wars that happened in the early 1800s with England. And I won't take the time to explain that. You can read about the Opium Wars in your book, but it's important to know that the English get Hong Kong after they get concessions from China as a result of the Opium Wars. And we'll read more about Hong Kong in upcoming chapters, but it's important to know that in the early 1800s, the British acquire Hong Kong. So it's really sort of the first acquisition in Asia, if you will. Before you close out the chapter, I would encourage you to look at the timeline that's on pages 596 and 597. Now, one of the things I like to stress and talk about is the impact of technology. And there's a school of thought out there. There's a term called technological determinism in history, and most historians don't believe in it. It's this idea that technology determines history. And I'm kind of a rogue in that sense. I sort of believe in technological determinism. And I think when you look at where we've come from this semester and what we've covered, some of the big inventions. So the caravel, which was the Portuguese sailing ship, which really allowed Columbus to come to the New World, was invented in the early 1400s. Gutenberg and the press, 1439. The Reformation, not really an invention, but sort of a new way of looking at Christianity. That whole schism with Martin Luther in 1517, I think really comes out of Gutenberg and the press because of the spread of ideas and the spread of Bibles and this idea that the church no longer controls information. So I think Gutenberg's important to the Reformation. And then if you look at that timeline in the back of the book that I just spoke of, you'll see that 1769, James Watt invents the steam engine. 1807, Fulton invents the steamship. 1830, the first railroad in England. The point is that there are a lot of things changing. And again, because of communication and because of information, these reform impulses seem to me to not be coincidental. They seem to me to be something that arises with the spread of new ideas. And then lastly, the other invention or the other technology, if you will, that's been important in this time period is gunpowder. Now, that's not something that came from the Western world. That's one of the big four Chinese inventions, if you will, and is really adopted in the West in the 1300s and 1400s. But certainly, gunpowder plays a huge role as European countries go to colonize countries in the New World, whether it be North America or South America. And then just to finish off, the big four Chinese inventions, if you will, I'll talk about them since I mentioned them. The big four are gunpowder, the compass, paper, and the press. Now, people credit Gutenberg with the printing press in 1439. His was a little bit different because it was movable type, and Chinese printing was woodblock printing. So again, Gutenberg could typeset individual letters, where woodblock printing could as well, but it was a little bit different in the way it worked. So as far as being a Western historian goes, generally movable type is Gutenberg's big invention, and the press itself, the idea of reproducing art or print, really comes from the Chinese. So those are the Chinese big four. A little background information for you. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week. Keep up the good work. Be safe. Bye bye.